Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is discuss Final Fantasy. This video is part of an ongoing series of in-depth reviews and analysis of RPGs. Note that this review is based on the original version of the game and will use footage from the NES and PS1, though all remakes will be discussed. The year is 1987. A young game designer named Hironobu Sakaguchi has reached the end of his rope. The company he worked for, Square, began its life as the software division of Denyu Sha, a power line construction company. In 1986, they became an independent company. The entirety of Square's existence had been plagued with unsuccessful titles for the Nintendo Famicom. Sakaguchi, the company's director of planning and development, was ready to retire from the gaming industry and return to Yokohama National University, from where he had dropped out a few years earlier. But if his potential last game turned out to be a success, he would reconsider. Sakaguchi for years had wanted to make a RPG, having been inspired by Ultima and Wizardry, but his employers believed that it would be a financial failure. The success of Dragon Quest, however, caused Square to change their stance and approve the project Fighting Fantasy. However, after pitching the game, only 3 people volunteered to help work on it. Sakaguchi was quite unpopular, as he had a reputation of being a rough boss, even though his games did not sell very well. On top of that, many within the company didn't have much faith in his ability to create a hit game. Sakaguchi had to reach out to get others to join what would become a 7-man group known as the A-Team. Compare this to Square's other teams, such as Sakaguchi's friends and fellow dropout Hiromichi Tanaka's B-Team, which had 20 members. Sakaguchi would be the head designer and concept writer. Famous programmer Nazaire Gabelli programmed the game. Akitoshi Kawazu programmed the battle system, which of course was inspired by Dungeons & Dragons and PC RPGs. The team was determined to include many concepts that had yet to become popular in RPGs in Japan, and even include ideas that were not in RPGs yet at all. It was suggested that they hire Yoshitaka Amano to do the art. Sakaguchi replied that he had never heard of him, and instead showed magazine clippings of what he'd like the art to be like, which of course were drawn by Amano. Upon realizing this, he was hired. Nobuo Uematsu, who was already a veteran of video game soundtracks, would be brought on to score the game as well. Final Fantasy most definitely took inspiration from Dragon Quest, especially in terms of structure, but at the same time, the A-Team were driven by the desire to create a game different from Dragon Quest, with its own unique identity. Square planned on only creating 200,000 copies, but Sakaguchi argued vehemently that 400,000 should be shipped instead. Back then, the process of getting ROM to cartridge could take months and usually only made the amount of cartridges you expected to sell. He argued that a sequel would be more viable if more copies were around to be sold. Management decided to take a chance on the game. Prior to release, Fighting Fantasy was renamed Final Fantasy. Some have speculated that this was because Square was on the verge of bankruptcy, which was true to an extent, but in interviews, Sakaguchi corrected this, claiming that the title was more personal. He firmly believed that it was his last game. Final Fantasy would be released on December 18, 1987. On July 12, 1990, it would be localized in North America. Final Fantasy's first big departure can be seen by stepping into a random encounter. Some games wanted to pay homage to first-person dungeon crawlers. Some games wanted top-down overworlds and dungeons with first-person combat. But Final Fantasy would be influential by having everything in a top-down perspective. In the right window would be your party, in the left window the enemies. A sense of size and scale conveyed a variety of feelings. Up to 9 enemies could fit in the enemy screen, giving the sense of fighting large hordes. Stronger enemies were matched by their size, and bosses filled the entire window. Final Fantasy was the beginning of what console-style RPGs would become known for. Complex character-building mechanics interlaced with a complex battle system. Character placement, for example, mattered. Whoever was in the first position would be attacked 50% of the time, in the second position 25%, and the people in the third and fourth both 12.5% of the time. Anyone who has played a game in this series knows that speed matters, though how that translates varies depending on the game. In the debut title, combat included a hit system, which acted as a multiplier. For every 32 points in hit percent, characters would get another hit. Being a powerhouse didn't just mean being strong, it meant being fast. This changed the way one thought about equipment, as some weapons prioritized strength, while others prioritized hit percent. Understanding which weapons were appropriate, especially if you were close to attaining the ability to get another hit, was advantageous. Most impressive was the robustness of the magic system. Dragon Quest II had 22 spells, Ultima IV had 26, Final Fantasy contained 64. Each element had 3 tiers of magic. Individual healing and group healing had 4 levels each. Holy magic had 5 levels, but more important were the buffing and debuffing abilities. There were 2 or 3 tiers of magic that buffed your evasion and buffed your defense. But the most important ability was fast, known better today as haste, which buffed your own hit percent, turning your attacker into a powerhouse. Anti-fire, anti-lightning, and anti-ice repelled certain elemental attacks. Temper and saber are supposed to buff strength, and lock 2 are supposed to lower the enemy's evade, but more on them later. Elemental rock, paper, scissors, as well as bombarding the undead with holy attacks, is a concept so conventional today that we forget that it had to be invented. Final Fantasy was one of the first, if not the first, to translate these ideas from tabletop to video games. Rather than having an MP bar, this game has MP charges. The more you level up, the more charges you get. This completely changed the way you thought about fighting, as there is a constant sense of choice as to whether this is or isn't a good time to use a spell. Final Fantasy's magic system was made up of magic levels, and each person being able to only learn 3 spells per level. All spells are divided up accordingly. You can only learn better spells if you have both the money to buy them and if your character is the appropriate magic level to learn them. And when you have fulfilled the appropriate criteria, you can only choose 3 out of the 4 spells available per level, forcing you to make tough choices. Some weapons and armor, much like in Dragon Quest, had special effects if used in battle. The biggest difference is that there are a lot in this game, allowing anyone to deal second-tier magic spells or high-end defensive buffs like invisibility too. The game actually becomes much easier since white mages and wizards have offensive options, and anyone can now use support abilities to help out white mages and white wizards. But even this creates a sense of choice. Each character's inventory is limited to 4 weapons and 4 pieces of armor each, making you choose which to keep and which to dispose of. One standout feature, one that is rarely put to use in modern RPGs, is that evasion actually matters. While other games have this feature, it tends to be more of an addition and not a primary feature. With knights, they're built to wear armor, which due to extra weight lowers their evasion. But for most other classes, evasion should absolutely be taken into consideration. Sometimes it was beneficial to wear no armor, or wait for special armors like armlets, which increase defense without penalizing evasion too much, so that characters could best benefit. It would often be more prudent to cast invisibility on characters rather than fog, because it was more important to raise their evasion more quickly than their defense. Certain strategies were class-specific. Final Fantasy's class system was made up of only 6 classes, substantially less than other class-based RPGs at the time. But what separated it was the depth within those very classes and in the way they played. Each also had a master class similar to Wizardry, bestowed upon you by the Dragon King Bahamut, making his first appearance in the franchise. And I have to say, the stark visual difference in the way the beginner classes and master classes are drawn really conveys a stark feeling that you've evolved into something special. The fighter is your frontline attacker and frontline tank. He has extremely high physical power and hit percent. His defense means that you want him in the first position. The fighter's master class, the knight, did everything the fighter did, but better, with the added benefit of being able to learn up to level 3 white magic. By that point in the game, that level of healing is irrelevant in battles, but it does give some extra charges for healing outside of combat. Revealing even more of Final Fantasy's complexity is the first of 2 of what I like to call risk and reward characters. The Black Belt went against everything you were trained to do in an RPG. While it's a good idea to buy nunchucks for the Black Belt at first, as he levels up, you want to remove them as his bare fists do more damage than an armed Black Belt. His fists also seem to provide bonus hit multipliers as he levels up. The Black Belt's defense is equal to his level, which means he doesn't need armor in the long run. However, it's for these same reasons that the Black Belt is a risk and reward character. The damage output and the defense of the Black Belt are low for the first 10 levels. He is even a liability at times. But the brutal output the Black Belt will be able to perform is worth it, as he will become the game's highest damage dealer with strength and very high hit percent. And the innate defense will save you money as well. His master class, the Master, is absolutely worth it, as he is probably the most dangerous character in the game. The Thief is the second risk and reward character. Playing as the Thief is miserable. He has miserable attack power, has miserable defense, and has miserable gains. There isn't even a stealing functionality. The only thing the Thief is really good at is running away. In complete contrast to the Thief is its master class, the Ninja. Ninjas have great attack power and extremely high hit percent, allowing them to be excellent damage dealers. Their defense, while not the best in the game, is certainly a significant improvement over the Thief. They can also equip most of the game's armor. On top of that, they have the highest evasion in the game. An added bonus is that the ninja can learn up to level 4 black magic. While that doesn't sound enticing, it means you have an extra hand in casting haste. Next are the game's 3 mages. The first is the Black Mage. Not much is different from what you would expect. They can equip knives, but they don't do much damage. They have low defense, meaning you should place them in the 3rd or 4th spot, but they can learn the extremely powerful attacks that will carry you throughout the game, and will gain a lot of MP charges to make use of them. And he learns Slow, which lowers the enemy's hit percent, and Haste, which raises your own. His master class, the Black Wizard, is basically a far more powerful Black Mage. The White Mage and its upgrade, the White Wizard, can equip hammers, which deal low damage. The primary purpose of the White Mage is threefold. The first is healing, the second is buffing, the last is dealing damage to undead enemies. Final Fantasy from beginning to end is packed with enemies vulnerable to any of the White Mage's 5 tiers of unleashing blinding light from the heavens. The last class is the Jack of all trades, the Red Mage. Classes that could do decent offensive magic and decent physical combat, or do the combination of decent offensive magic and decent healing magic were available in games before Final Fantasy. But a class that had good physical attack, good defense, good offensive magic, good healing, with no real mastery of any of these areas was original. The Red Mage and its upgrade, the Red Wizard, are a favorite of Final Fantasy players due to his versatility. It's up to you as to what you feel your Red Mage should accomplish, but there are a couple of downsides to this class as well. The biggest negative is that he gains MP charges slower and gains less of them compared to the dedicated mages. He can't learn, even as the Red Wizard, certain attacks at all, and is even barred from learning any level 8 spells. You could choose if you wanted him to be your primary or extra magic offense, healing, support, or if you wanted to give him a variety of abilities to fill in any gaps that you felt your other mages weren't covering, with having him learn any of the above depending on what you felt was necessary for your overall strategy. In the end, there may have only been 6 classes, but the game was well balanced, whereas many other games had a few useless classes. Assuming that you are playing a version of the game with the original mechanics, the game can be very difficult, especially early on, but I enjoy the struggle. It makes it feel like you're rising up from being a nobody. It felt so rewarding when you finally received the master classes, as it made it feel as if all your hard work was worth it. It is at this point I want to pose a question. What is a RPG? Role-playing implies playing a role. That sounds redundant, but it describes everything good about Final Fantasy. Playing a role implies making choices and decisions and dealing with the consequences of those decisions. It means you are forced to make them and live with them. It means saying just as planned, or I screwed up, are realities. That's Final Fantasy in a nutshell. Everything is about making decisions. As a good thinking man's RPG, there is much to consider. You must choose a team, and you must choose wisely. A team of knights is theoretically invincible, but it would be ludicrously expensive in terms of equipment. A team with no mages saves on buying spells, but it means you'll have a tough time against groups. Do I choose a red mage, who can do decent physical damage? Do I take a risk by choosing a thief? Do I choose the weapon that gives me greater strength or greater hit percent? Of the 4 level 5 white magic spells, which one do I have to leave out? Which spells mesh best with my team? For example, Ruse, which raises the caster's evasion, isn't that important, but if I'm doing an all-white mage run, it suddenly becomes a priority. This armlet will give my master 24 defense, and will only lower his evasion by 1, but he'll be level 24 in a few levels. Should I buy it or should I wait? I have limited funds. Which equipment and armor are the most important? I'm in a tough fight, so do I use one of my precious charges to cast Fire 2, or should I hold back? Everything in this game is deliberate. The game comes from an era where RPGs appeal to techies who didn't mind doing a bit of number crunching and investigating, hence why the game rewards you for understanding its statistics in detail. Final Fantasy may not be a game with huge obvious mechanics, but it is a game with many little touches that beg to be micromanaged, and that's what made it so fun. However, there are a few issues that stand out. Like I said, this game appealed to techies who didn't mind doing a bit of number crunching and investigating. Because of that, the first game doesn't explain itself very well at all, at least for the modern gamer. I don't think this game should have handholding, but I do believe there is a fine line between not explaining the basics of your mechanics and not explaining the finer details of your mechanics. Another issue is one the game is famous for, the lack of auto-targeting. If 2 characters attacked an enemy and the first killed it, all subsequent attacks will miss. While I find the game's difficulty to be tough but fair, there is a certain situation where I do think the game's cheap. That being when you encounter an enemy formation packed with status-afflicting enemies. Most infamous are hordes of cockatrices, prepared to stone your entire party, leading to a game over. But equally annoying are certain enemies that can end up trapping you in paralysis and essentially keep you in a state of inaction for what could potentially be forever. One thing that should be accounted for is that from the time you reach the elf village, Up until Mount Gulg, the game can be pretty slow. The combination of lots of text missing at this point, you being weak, the damage calculation feeling somewhat all over the place, and some grinding necessary to do the Marsh Cave leaves battles at this point of the game feeling overly long. But the issue that tends to stand out in the game are its glitches. As I alluded to earlier, spells that buff physical strength, spells that lower the enemy's evasion, and a few others are glitched. Weapons that are supposed to get bonus damage against certain kinds of enemies do not get that bonus damage due to glitches as well. Blindness, which lowers accuracy, does nothing, though that is more of a benefit since certain elemental fiends are predisposed to using blindness, which means you're essentially handed a free turn. The intelligence stat is bugged, which means that if you have a black mage and a red mage cast the same spell, the former won't do more damage than the latter. The unpolished nature of the game is possibly the game's biggest failing. To quickly skim through the exploration, Final Fantasy works as how many console-style RPGs did, with a very open overworld. Much like Dragon Quest II, the first portion of the game is linear, with the land shaped in the direction of your next objective, but open enough in its scope to allow for discoveries. Much like Dragon Quest before it, Final Fantasy's progression is primarily investigative. You must be the active investigator who learns the information he can from those you encounter and use it to understand where to go next. As you progress through the game and unlock more vehicles, more and more of the map becomes available to explore at your leisure. While the game is open, note that it's not a non-linear game, as things must be done in a certain order, side quests notwithstanding. Contrary to many games at the time, Final Fantasy gives you a ship extremely early. However, the ship can only land at certain docks. This may make the game seem like an overall downgrade compared to other titles, but the game includes one of the most groundbreaking additions in an RPG at the time: flight. Final Fantasy introduced gamers to the airship, which liberated the player and allowed them to travel anywhere they wanted. Almost anywhere anyway. But there is no denying that it completely changed the way one thought about travel and exploration in an RPG, and its influence on the genre is unmistakable. The dungeons are vast and complex as one would expect of an NES RPG, with all kinds of dead ends and traps. Some are even set up in a way that they immediately present you with multiple paths, with only one leading to progress, though the layouts don't exactly exude subtlety. Still, they're fun, they make you think, and they certainly get more complex as the game goes on. What makes the dungeons stand out are the variety. The first Elemental Fiend dungeon is your basic descent into the unknown. The second has entire floors made of HP scraping lava. The Ice Cavern is tricky in its use of collapsing ice. The Castle Floor Ordeals is one of the earliest examples of a teleportation dungeon. The Sunken Shrine starts you on the 3rd floor, with story-based objectives being on both the 5th and the 1st floor. Final Fantasy overall is actually not very grindy, with the only times you may have to grind are to gain 1 or 2 levels at the beginning, then you will have to do some very intense grinding before the Marsh Cave, and perhaps you will want to grind a little more before the Ice Cavern. Moving on to the economy, I don't want to go too in-depth, as I feel I've already alluded to how it works before. Throughout the game you have limited funds, and must decide between the equipment you must buy and the spells, which can get very expensive. You're forced to make hard decisions, choosing what to buy now and what to leave behind. Further complicating your decisions are occasional super equipment with high prices, and towns sometimes having multiple levels of magic shops. I want to take a moment, however, to rebut the claims of certain reviewers that because every town offers so much to buy, that it quote-unquote forces you to grind throughout the game to buy everything. Final Fantasy was made in a time where you had to make tough decisions, buy what you felt you needed as part of a role-playing experience, and come back later when you had money to buy the rest. Role-playing implies choices. If you want to grind for them, that is up to you and your style of gameplay. But the claim that the game is forcing you to grind to buy everything is pure nonsense, and is nothing more than the influence of certain popular RPGs that have encouraged the, if I may say, pussification of RPGs, where all the money you need to buy everything in the next town is practically handed to you. Visually, I want to mention that for 1987, the graphical fidelity was really good. The monster designs stand out nicely. They look as if someone took Amano's sketches and translated them one-to-one into pixel art without sacrificing anything in the process. That's truly amazing. The music from Nobuo Uematsu, who gave us a lot of varying dungeon themes, is amazing, and of course he would give us many chimes and sounds that would become synonymous with the franchise. We now move on to story. 4 young men suddenly arrive at Corneria, bearing 4 unique crystals. Foretold by the prophet Lucan, the heroes of light have appeared, but before saving the world, tragedy has struck, as the princess has been kidnapped by the once proud knight Garland. The newly arrived group prove their worth by converging upon the Temple of Fiends, and defeating the legendary warrior. The grateful princess feels the need to hand you a lute, passed down among the ladies of the Corneria royal line, an item that Garland for some reason took from the princess. As they leave for the north to deal with the mysteriously decaying earth, a dangerously active volcano, seas that are raging, and winds that flow no more, lingering questions remain. Why did Garland want the princess? And why did he want her lute? Within a good half hour of gameplay, you have saved the princess. Some people believe that this may have been the game's way of saying that it was deeper than Dragon Quest, as they think it makes them sound smart or something. But Dragon Quest II had already began bucking this trend 11 months prior. It is, admittedly, a way of saying this story would go beyond shallow cliches in general. Final Fantasy is the home to many new concepts and ideas. Upon crossing the Northern Bridge, you are treated to a cinematic-style credit sequence. It works well enough and isn't too invasive. While the game has an overarching narrative, much like Dragon Quest II, each city has its own personality and personal issues which can often take precedence, such as the elf prince being cursed to sleep, or how the appearance of the Fiend of Water disturbed an entire city's economy. Much like the RPGs of the time, most of Final Fantasy's story is interactive, with story details and advancement occurring through speaking with NPCs and making advancements based on what you are told. But something new is that the game was also one of the earliest examples of certain NPCs having their dialogue change when you dealt with the issues within their area, or when you gathered a certain item, allowing the world to feel a little more alive. Woven throughout the adventure are references to all kinds of fantasy works. The mermaids are terrified that they'll dissolve into sea foam. While seemingly bizarre, this is a reference to Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, where this was the fate of their aquatic race. A lady who is often the butt of jokes rambles on about her legs, but pay close attention. When you reach the undersea shrine, one of the mermaids says she had a friend who never came back. It suddenly becomes apparent that there is only one kind of being who could possibly be excited to have appendages the rest of us take for granted. The game is filled with references to Dungeons & Dragons, J.R.R. Tolkien, and fairy tales. One of Final Fantasy's biggest contributions to RPG stories is as follows. The four heroes of light hear rumors of a device that apparently causes objects to float. At the end of a long and arduous cavern of ice, the rumors appear to have truth to them. Further legends lead the young companions to a long-buried ship. A ship, when paired with the flotation device, allows it to fly. But apparently, this isn't the end of the strangeness. A man claims to have seen a large metal object fall from the sky toward the waterfall. Your investigation leads you to, of all things, a bipedal machine that can speak. Where did it come from? Talk of an ancient civilization reach your ear. The journey eventually leads to a lone desert tower, populated by all kinds of odd machinery, and yet another robot who tells you to use a foreign device at the top. And then it is there you stand in the home of a once prosperous civilization, a city suspended in the stars. Unlike many fantasy stories of the time where the setting is a stand-in for our history, the Swords and Dragons era is actually the future. The concept of an ancient civilization, which disappeared for whatever reason, found its inception here. Final Fantasy, however, wasn't the first game to include science fiction elements in a fantasy RPG, but it was the first to make it work. Ultima 1 didn't exactly have the best implementation of space shuttles and TIE fighters. Finally, I want to discuss the endgame. Warning, endgame spoilers ahead. The Heroes of Light discovered that the Fiends had been focusing their power on one central location, the Temple of Fiends. The end of the group's battle brings them back to the location of their first battle. By using the power of the four crystals, they find themselves transported to the Temple of Fiends 2,000 years prior. Using the loot the princess gave them, they uncover a sealed passageway into the lower depths of the shrine. There, after killing the four fiends once again, they encounter Garland, who survived their first encounter. Suddenly, everything makes sense. Garland wanted the loot at the beginning because he wanted to access the power that was in this ancient temple. However, the Heroes of Light defeated him, but thanks to the swift action of the four fiends in the future, they were able to send him back in time. Garland then transforms into the malevolent Chaos. Upon his defeat, the heroes travel back through time, but realize much will be different, as it would be as if none of the events they went through ever occurred, since the time loop is now broken. Even Garland would be there. Theirs was a final battle to stop the cause of all battles. A Final Fantasy, if you will. Questions remain. Was Garland always Chaos? Did he somehow become Chaos? At what point in history did the time loop begin? What caused it to begin in the first place? We are offered no answers, but that seems to be exactly the point. A time loop, a never-ending cycle in which Chaos and his minions have rule that has no real beginning or end, is the pure embodiment of Chaos itself. Like most RPGs of the era, you have to read between the lines, and the story can be a bit thin at times, to the point some people write off the original game's story. But I give Final Fantasy a little more credit. I think it's rather smart, and it shows how forward-thinking Sakaguchi was. Garland's return is also one of the first big plot twists in video game history, and it's worth mentioning just for that. Before I finish, this would be a good time to mention that every numbered Final Fantasy more or less follows the same formula that began in this game. The game opens with more or less a political conflict. A more universal set of issues begin to unfold and begin to overshadow that political conflict. And a certain human connected to the political conflict gains unfathomable powers. All subsequent titles owe the first game this blueprint. Final Fantasy had a number of remakes after the original NES release. The MSX2 port sports some minor visual improvements, battles move along faster, and some musical changes, but suffers from very slow scrolling. The title was later re-released along with Final Fantasy II in a single package for the Famicom, which has a few touch-ups to the graphical fidelity. In 2000, Final Fantasy would see its first re-release in over a decade for the Wonderswan color. The game sports a new graphical overhaul, which manages to update the game while maintaining the spirit of the original game's art style. The new sprites are well drawn, well animated, and overall are well done. Battles contain fully drawn, colorful backgrounds. The updated animations for the attacks look absolutely fantastic. The updates to the monster designs are noteworthy, especially the four fiends. A new introductory opening has been added which explains the condition of the world. It's actually quite atmospheric and does its job well. Additional cutscenes occur at various intervals, and some dialogue has been expanded to further flesh out the game. Most of them are fitting and are not intrusive at all. Most likely surprising, but now obvious to the viewers of this video, is that the design of the Wonderswan Color remake became the basis of all remakes that came afterwards. The music has been redone, but honestly doesn't sound very pleasing due to the Wonderswan Color's weak sound capabilities. New tracks have been added for the boss battles, which fit in so well that I forget they are exclusive to the remakes. Gameplay-wise, it plays almost exactly the same as the NES version, but with some differences. The glitches have been fixed, opening up new lines of strategy. You can now toggle on or off auto-targeting, the ability to use certain items in battle that would not work before, among other features. This version also includes a quick save which allows you to save anywhere but turns the game off afterwards. A new dash functionality allows your characters to move rapidly. Many enemies, including bosses, have received huge HP boosts, making the game even harder. Battles now run faster and more spontaneously thanks to better technology. You can now see how equipment modifies stats, and if someone has room to learn a new spell. The only big gameplay disappointment in my opinion is that everyone having their own inventories is now gone. Overall, music aside, this is an excellent remake. Final Fantasy I would receive a new release on the Sony PlayStation in Japan, and would be re-released along with Final Fantasy II as Final Fantasy Origins for a worldwide release. For the most part, this is the Wonderswan Color version of the game with graphical tweaks and much higher sound quality. As with any PS1 game, the creation of a FMV opening sequence was practically mandatory. Other additions include an art gallery, a treasure checklist, a becetary, the ability to soft reset, and rumble features. A new memo save lets you save anywhere, anytime, but is erased once you turn the system off. A new easy mode is available which changes the magic system and buffs your characters. More on that in a moment. If you want to experience the original NES Final Fantasy with more polish, less glitches, and moves along much faster, the PS1 version is your best option. In my opinion, it is the best remake of the original game. The Game Boy Advance saw the release of Final Fantasy I and II, Dawn of Souls. The FMVs have been removed due to the system's technology. Unlike the PS1 release, which gave you an option, the entire game is based on the PS1 game's easy mode. Gone are the MP charges, instead replaced by MP bars, giving the mages huge MP pools which allow you to pretty much destroy the game. Everyone attains more hits, turning all random encounters into battles where you can just match attack. There's no thinking anymore. The Thief and the Black Belt have been buffed, making them no longer risk and reward classes. In fact, everyone has been buffed, making the game way too easy. There's no need to look out for your evasion stat or manage your hit percent because everything is handed to you. In fact, you really don't have to manage anything in this game at all because everything's so automatic. The prices for equipment and spells are lower. Essentially, many of the mechanics are irrelevant. Dawn of Souls adds 4 new dungeons collectively known as the Soul of Chaos. These dungeons have floors that are randomly chosen. Every time you do them, you'll do every floor but in a different order. These dungeons contain brand new equipment and 4 bosses each from Final Fantasy III through VI. Unfortunately, the enemies are extremely underpowered and they're all recolors, making random encounters boring. The worst is the Life Spring Grotto, where everything is really easy, but then you must fight Shinryu or Omega at the end, who are both capable of obliterating you if you're under level 60. Don't get me wrong, I love tough bosses, but I hate it when the dungeon gives you a false sense of what to expect, and then suddenly drops a mega boss on you. And since you cannot beat all of the bosses in a single run of the first 3 dungeons, you have to do them multiple times. In the end, a poor addition to an already questionable remake. Around this time, yet another version of the game came out for mobile phones. The Final Fantasy 20th Anniversary Edition for the PlayStation Portable is based on the Game Boy Advance version, but now features new and improved graphics. And by new and improved, I actually mean that it looks like a Flash game. I like the way the new sprites are actually drawn, but the way everything is colored, looks, and moves feels like something made in RPG Maker. The PS1 FMV has been brought back, and looks exactly like how it did on the PS1. The overhead map perspective has been changed to a 3/4 top-down view, which sometimes works, but at other times looks odd. Some locations now include animations in the air, such as smoke, which sometimes works well, and other times not so well. This edition also includes a new bonus dungeon known as the Labyrinth of Time. Each floor layout is randomly chosen from a set, and what set you get depends on how deep into the dungeon you are. These floors contain timed puzzles, with the time you get created by what attributes you wish to seal. Many of the puzzles are annoying rather than fun, and equally irritating are the plentiful, underpowered random encounter recolors. At the end, you fight the super boss Cronodia. Depending on how many puzzles you did or did not complete within their allotted time limits determines what form of her you fight, with the boss having a total of 8 forms, which means you need to complete the dungeon at least 8 times in order to gain full completion. As long as you're over level 70, it's not too difficult a dungeon or a super boss fight. In 2009, the original game was made available on the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console. The PS1 version could be purchased on the PlayStation Network for PS3 and later the PSP and Vita. The 20th Anniversary Edition was ported over to iOS and Windows phones. Android devices eventually received the same treatment, but without any of the bonus dungeons available. The original NES game is available on the Wii U and 3DS Virtual Console, but in Japan only. Most recently, the PSP version will once again be ported, this time to the 3DS eShop, updated with 3D capabilities. Final Fantasy did extremely well in Japan, selling its 400,000 copies. Some numbers even claim that the game sold around 520,000, though I don't know if that means the game received a second run, or if the sales of the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 pack are included. The game even did decently in the US, with around 320,000 games being sold. As for Sakaguchi, I don't think I need to tell you the outcome of his decision between going back to college and continuing to work for Square. A video on Final Fantasy II will speak for itself. When Yuji Horii created Dragon Quest, he started by simplifying and streamlining RPGs for the Japanese audience that was new to the genre, and then afterwards was slowly undoing the simplification with Dragon Quest II. One could say Final Fantasy was in the right place and right time after Dragon Quest already prepared the public for RPGs. While nowhere near Dragon Quest in terms of popularity in the East, Final Fantasy still managed to take its place as a staple RPG in Japan. Before I played Final Fantasy I, I expected that I would be playing a bare-bones game. While there is no in-your-face character-building system, Final Fantasy is filled with a combination of many smaller character-building mechanics that work together to create a unique experience. The hit system, the many intricacies of the magic system, the depth of each class, the way certain stats work together, among other things, to give deeper meaning to your equipment, it all meshes together. I know now what to do with every class and every team setup whenever I go into the game, but there's still a deep sense of satisfaction every time I go through it. Mechanical depth isn't just a matter of how many mechanics you have, but it's also a matter of how well those mechanics are implemented. And it also depends on balance as well, and that's what Final Fantasy I has, balance. Perhaps it doesn't when you're facing cockatrices, but the rest of the time it does. Its difficulty is fair. It's a game filled with decision-making that matters. Remember that gameplay choices don't matter if the game isn't properly built and properly challenging in a way that forces you to make those decisions. I think it's for this reason that people do Final Fantasy challenge runs and enjoy talking about them to this day. I think I may have given the impression during this video that I grew up with Final Fantasy. Actually, I didn't. In fact, I played the PS1 and PS2 games long before I ever played this one, and yet I find that I enjoy the original a lot more than I did some of the 3D titles. There is simply something satisfying about the game. I have done my best to pinpoint all of the little details that make the game so great. Perhaps that's just it, that Final Fantasy is the sum of all of its parts. The game pushes you more deeply, forcing you to become intimately aware of all those pieces that make up the game, and in the end, each come together to create a whole that keeps players enamored with the game, even after a long 30 years after the original release. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History of RPGs. Next time, we cover the lost history of early Japanese action RPGs. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.